Welcome to today's talk, which I'm going to introduce in just a moment, but I want to foreshadow our November 10th talk, which will be with Candace Shelby, who's one of our faculty members here, and they'll be rethinking addiction. Dr. Shelby just came out with a field-changing book, and so she'll be talking about the work she did in that book. I think there's a couple more chairs in the back. So I just want to put that on your calendar. We'll again have nice snacks and then good discussion. But today we have Garrett Bredeson, who's coming from CU Boulder, where he's an instructor in the Department of Philosophy. Garrett did his MA at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and I want to read his MA thesis title, and then I'll read you his Ph.D. thesis title. And for those of you familiar with these issues, I think we'll see an interesting trajectory. His MA thesis was G.E. Moore on common sense and analysis. And then he did his Ph.D. at Vanderbilt. We were there at the same time, and finished in 2014. Is that when you were?
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
December of 2014.
Okay, it was somewhere in 2014. And that, his Ph.D. dissertation was titled The Genesis of Heidegger's Reading of Kant. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, so G.E. Moore has a master's thesis, and then Heidegger a Ph.D. We were just talking about that trajectory. But I think one thing that helps to illuminate Dr. Bredeson's trajectory, he says in the statement I just found on the website, and I think we should do these for our websites, I think that tackling philosophical problems with rigor depends crucially on developing an appreciation not only for the true breadth of solutions that have been offered for them, but also for the diverse context of significance through which these problems have emerged. And I think that characterizes a lot of Dr. Bredeson's work as far as that I've been familiar with it. And I think we will see that today in his talk. Is it still called How Does Kantian Virtue Differ from Aristotelian Continence and Aristotelian Virtue?
That's still what I call it.
Okay, good. So please help me welcome Dr. Bredeson.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you again for having me down here. I really appreciate it. Good to see some of you. I'm sure I'll see you more of you. And I'll try to keep this around 45 minutes. I'm pretty good at keeping on this, but if I start droning, and I can drone with the best of them, then just call it me. Okay, so the title of the talk, so let's start with that. So I do still want to call it, How Does Kantian Virtue... Oh, let me shoot a handout too. So I do want to call it, How Does Kantian Virtue Differ from Aristotelian Continence and Aristotelian Virtue? And really, there's the first question, so there's two questions in the title, right? And the first question, how does it differ from Aristotelian Continence? This is a really old question, and it's gotten a lot of play over the years. The worry that Kantian virtue might just be Aristotelian Continence and nothing more, and I'll say more about what that is, Aristotelian Continence. But the worry that it might just be Aristotelian Continence, that's been around at least since the 1790s, at least in some form. And it's a worry that's gotten a lot of play in Anglophone philosophy over the last quarter century or so, partly because, as many of you probably know, there's been a rise in virtue ethics as kind of a new alternative to the previously kind of mainstream Anglophone traditions of utilitarianism and Kantianism. So with the rise of virtue ethics, which is inspired of course, by Aristotle, a lot of them had pushed the worry that, hey, one of the problems with Kant's way of thinking about morality is that he makes the best, most virtuous moral person just be continent on Aristotle's theory, and that's supposed to be a bad result for Kantians. So that's a worry that's been in the water for a long time, and it's gotten a lot of play recently. And so Kantians, of course, have tried to say a lot of things to defend Kant from this and say, no, that's not really the right way to think about it. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I see kind of the best Kantian answers as going to that question. But what I want to say, and I guess I'll take it to be no small feat if I can kind of convince you at least of this much. But what I want to say is that if you appreciate the way that Kantians have tried to answer this question, the best kinds of answers they've been able to give, you'll see that the real question isn't how Kantian virtue differs from Aristotelian continence, but rather how it differs from what Aristotle would just call virtue. In other words, Kantian virtue starts to look a lot more like Aristotelian virtue than you might think at first glance when you start kind of picking at the sides of it. So I guess the first thing I just want to do is I would like to kind of switch the conversation from the conversation that I think most people have been having, which is trying to differentiate Kantian virtue from Aristotelian continence and show that the real question, the more interesting one, is how it differs from Aristotelian virtue, at least. And like I said, I mean, if I can just convince you of that, that'll be success. You know, I'll be very happy with that. But then, of course, I do want to say some things about that second question. I want to say a little bit about how I see it, Kantian virtue differing from Aristotelian virtue. And broadly speaking, and I'll be able to say a little bit about this, what I think is true is that in some sense, I think the Aristotelian story is still right for Kant, but he wants to complement it with another kind of story as well. I'm going to call it a Pauline story. I think this is a little abstract here. And I don't know whether this is something that St. Paul actually held or not, but when Kant talks about this, he's always referencing Paul, so that's why I call it Pauline at least. And what he thinks is that there has to be a story of basically a moral revolution, a complete change of character that takes place, which doesn't quite fit Aristotle's story of the gradual development of character through habituation to become virtuous. And Kant wants to say, in some sense, that both stories are right from different points of view. This is a kind of classical Kantian movement. I'll say more about how he does that. So what I want to kind of conclude by saying then is a little something about how I see Kant actually making this Pauline move, which isn't replacing the Aristotelian account, but is supposed to kind of complement. So that's the basic idea. That's what I want to do. And if I can do both those things, that's just a roaring success. But I'll be happy if I can just do it first. So just briefly, so here's kind of the outline. Here's kind of the steps of the process as I see it. So first, I want to just kind of talk about what the old questions are, why people have thought that Kantian virtue might just be Aristotelian continence and nothing more. And kind of the classical place where these questions are raised is in these really famous examples that Kant gives right at the beginning of the Groundwork when he's trying to talk about the goodwill. And we'll go through these examples. They'll be familiar to many of you. If not, you're lucky to get to hear them for the first time because they're wonderful. But I think it'll become pretty clear once we say something about Aristotelian continence why a lot of people have thought that when Kant defines the real moral worth of the Groundwork, why that might just look like Aristotelian continence. So then I'll say a little bit about how Kantians have tried to answer this question. There's an old answer that's been in the literature, actually just talking to Sam, I just met, and is teaching Peyton's book from 1947, and it's actually great on this, and this, I quote Peyton in here. And Peyton's got some good answers to this, but I want to kind of say that it doesn't get you all the way to the worries that that have been raised by the Aristotelians, and that there's a kind of deeper question here that even Peyton's kind of response doesn't quite address. So in kind of drawing on some more recent work now that's been done in this, and in particular, I'm not going to say much about them, but I just want to flag that I'm drawing heavily here on the work of Barbara Herman and Anne Margaret Baxley and Kant scholarship. But in recent literature, a lot of people have started to do more work on Kant's theory of virtue when he's really talking about virtue proper, especially in his later writings like the Metaphysics of Morals. And I think you can say something more then. But the thing that you can say more is going to just make Kantian virtue start to look a lot like Aristotelian virtue, I think. And sometimes this isn't fully appreciated, even from people who are taking this strategy in the Kantian literature. So I kind of want to say, look, I mean, you get a good answer to why it's not just Aristotelian continence, but now we actually differentiate Kant from Aristotle at all, because it looks like it's a very Aristotelian position he ends up adopting. So then I'll say more about how I think that, again, there's this Pauline element in Kant's thought. And if I have time, I'll just say, I mean, what I would like to say something about, and it's connected to the Pauline element in Kant's theory of virtue, but what I'd like to say something about is kind of like, on Kant's view, what is it like to live a moral life? Like, what is it like to live a virtuous life on Kant's view? Because I think that really the root of these kind of questions between Aristotle and Kant on these things, as far as I can tell, the root of them is that there's a really nice Aristotelian story about like what it's like to lead a virtuous life, and something that we all can kind of recognize. At least a lot of people take themselves to kind of recognize this. Yeah, I can see what that's like. That seems right. In Kant, we don't get anything like that, like a story of what it's like to live a virtuous life. A phenomenology of virtue, like the loosest and broadest sense. In Kant, we get a lot of really interesting things about moral theory, but we don't get a straightforward account of what it's like to live a virtuous life. And I think if we could flesh that out a little bit, then we would have a little more straightforward kind of point of comparison between Aristotle's theory and Kant's theory as well. So they're all just kind of gesture in that direction, a few things that you might say if you're starting to kind of do something like a phenomenology of virtue for Kant. But I think that, in some ways, I think that's a really important project for people to engage in. I don't know if I ever will, but you guys can take up the project if I need to. Okay, so that's the game plan, basically. All right, so let's start with Groundwork 1. So this is the very opening pages of the Groundwork here. And they're famous in part because if you don't read anything else by Kant, you oftentimes read this. So I mean, a lot of people know this kind of stuff. What these examples are trying to do, and these are passages 1 and 2 on your handout. What these passages are supposed to do in Kant is that they're supposed to demonstrate what our concept of the good will is. And Kant thinks, he seems to think at least, that if you can really if you can give good examples here, everyone's going to be like, yeah, that's what the good will is. Like, he thinks no one's going to disagree with that. Maybe some like philosophers, like overeducated elites, you know. There wouldn't be anyone like that in this room, right? But you know, maybe some of them would resist these accounts. But like, you know, the man in the street, or for Kant, it would be like, you know, Rousseau's peasants up in the Alps. You know, like they're going to be like, oh yeah, that's what the good will is. That's real moral work. And the distinction that he thinks is kind of underlying this, and he's really trying to draw on these passages, is the distinction between doing something in accordance with duty and doing something from duty. Again, it's a distinction you're probably familiar with if you've looked at these passages. So let me just read through these passages real briefly, and I'll just say a few things about them. The first one, and I'll call this one the prudent shopkeeper example here. Here's what Kant says. It says, for example, it's certainly in accordance with duty for a dealer not to overcharge an inexperienced purchaser. And wherever there's much commerce, the prudent merchant will not overcharge, but rather maintain a fixed general price for everyone, so that a child may buy from him just as well as anyone else. Thus his service is honest, but this is not nearly enough to make us believe on that account that the merchant has acted this way from duty and from principles of honesty. His own advantage required it. So in other words, right, I mean, Kant is saying, I mean, yeah, the merchant is doing the right thing here, right, by not overcharging the child who comes into his shop, but we don't really give him moral credit for it. Why? Because his own advantage requires him to do it. And what's the story here? I mean, you could imagine a number of stories you could tell, but you know, maybe if he overcharges the child, it'll get out that he's been overcharging children. You know, then we'll boycott to the store of this, you know, exploitative merchant or whatever. But it was some story like that. Kant thinks it would be obvious to tell here, and so we shouldn't give him too much moral credit for that. Let me read the second example, then I'll say a few things. And the second example, I think, is potentially more troubling here. And we'll call this one the friend of humanity example. That's often what it's called. So, it's a duty to be beneficent where one can. Moreover, there are many souls so sympathetically constituted that, without any further motive of vanity or self-interestedness, they find an inner enjoyment in spreading joy around, and can delight in the satisfaction of others insofar as it's their work. But I maintain that in such a case, this kind of action, spreading joy around, however much it may be amiable and, again, in accordance with duty, nevertheless has no true moral worth. Suppose then, so now he's going to modify the example. Suppose then the mind of this friend of humanity were clouded over with his own grief, extinguishing all sympathy with the fate of others, and suppose him still to have the capacity to benefit others in distress, even though he's not touched by their trouble, because he's sufficiently absorbed with his own. And now suppose that even though no inclination impels him to it any longer, he nevertheless tears himself out of this deadly insensibility and performs the action without any inclination at all, but solely from duty. Then, for the first time, it has genuine moral worth. Okay? So again, the basic story here is we're supposed to imagine, you know, someone who has this great, amiable, sympathetic disposition who likes to benefit everyone around him. But he kind of just does it because he likes doing it. That's just that's the kind of disposition he has. But then his mind is clouded over with sorrow. This is great. Kant loves these sorts of examples. You know, and once he's beclouded, you know, now when he like brings himself to benefit other people, just because it's the right thing to do, now for the first time, he says, right, his action has genuine. Okay, so in both these examples, but really in more so the second one, what some people have found troubling about this is that it seems like the guy here is getting moral credit for acting only when it is either against his interests in the first one or against his natural inclinations. And okay, maybe, but that sounds weird to a lot of people. And why does it sound weird? Well, one reason you might think it's weird is because of the kind of reason that Schiller pointed to right away in the 1790s. So Schiller's got a really interesting essay on grace and dignity where he develops these worries more, but I just want to give you a few lines from this poem that he wrote a few years later. And by the way, I mean, Schiller is actually kind of joking about this. Schiller doesn't really take this to be a critique of Kant in any rich sense, but he definitely thinks there's a grain of truth in it. And it's the grain of truth that I kind of want to point to and emphasize here. So this is quotation 3 on the handout. He says, "Here's my scruples of conscience, right? I like to serve my friends, but unfortunately I do it from inclination. So I'm often bothered by the thought, I'm not a virtuous person. So I'll decide, right? There's no other way but this. You must learn to despise them and do with repugnance what duty bids you, you know? Then we can really be virtuous. Then, for the first time, my action will have genuine moral weight, right? And so you can see pretty obviously what the problem is here. It looks like Kant is saying that we really only get moral worth to do things when it's hard for us to do it, and when we are doing it against our, in some sense, when we're fighting against ourselves to do it. And I just want to now point out that when you look at Kant's account of virtue now in the later works, at least when he describes virtue in these kind of canonical descriptions of virtue that he gives, and I take it that 4 and 5 on your handout are both, like, I think should be very canonical places where Kant talks about virtue. He makes a lot of offhand comments here and there, but these are some core quotations. But when he's talking about virtue, I mean, if you look at just his kind of like straight line definition, it looks like he definitely has this problem. So just, let's look at 4 just for example, we won't look at 5. 4 says, the moral level on which a human being stands is respect for the moral law. The conviction, the Gesinnung, it's a hard word in this context, so we can talk about it for next one. The conviction incumbent upon him to have in observing it is to do so from duty, not from voluntary fondness, nor even from an endeavor he undertakes unbidden, gladly, and of his own accord. He's kind of thinking about that sympathetic friend of humanity here, right? And his moral condition, in which he can always be, is virtue. That is, moral conviction in conflict. And not holiness in the supposed possession of the complete purity of the will's convictions. So I'm just, just take a look there. I mean, virtue, that is moral conviction in conflict. I mean, that seems to fit exactly with what we've been seeing so far, right? What is virtue? It's when you have moral convictions that can withstand the conflict that you have within yourself, basically. Now again, and that fits, I think, well with 1 and 2 here from Groundwork. But again, it just seems to kind of confirm the sorts of worries that Schiller is pointing to. And so, Aristotelians haven't been shy to point this out. That looks like this is what's going on. In fact, in some ways, just seeing this so far, I mean, this is the claim that Kantian virtue is no more than Aristotelian continence. Because Aristotelian continence, so let me say now something about the Aristotelian distinction. So as I understand Aristotle, at least, and I mean this in a broad sense, he says some confusing things sometimes about this. But Aristotle's idea of virtue is that a really virtuous person, a really virtuous agent, shouldn't have that hard a time doing the right sort of thing, at least in core cases. Right? I mean, you can think about kind of the story of moral development here, and kids, kids don't like to share things, right? I mean, you're like playing with your dinosaurs over here, and you see, some dude over there doesn't have any dinosaurs to play with, You might know it's the right thing to share your dinosaurs, but you don't want to do that. And kids don't do that. You have to make them do it, right? And then they get all sad and stuff. It's quite pitiful. But then at some point they kind of get that they should be doing it, right? And there's a point in their moral development when they kind of know they should be sharing. So you've got your 4 dinosaurs you're playing with, and then you give a couple to Billy over there, and Billy can play with the dinosaurs too. But it's really hard to do it. You're doing it because you know it's the right thing to do, but it hurts because you're getting so much pleasure from your dinosaurs that you're playing with, right? And now you're going to have less. You're going to have half as much pleasure because Billy's going to have those other dinosaurs. And so, this is the case of someone that Aristotle would think was like a continent person. They know what the right thing to do is, and they can make themselves do it, right? But they don't take pleasure in doing it. It's actually quite hard for them to do it. But then, as the kid grows up and becomes full-blown adults, like all of us who have no problem sharing ever, of course, right? We're all good. And for us, it's positively painful, If I had all my dinosaurs over here and Sarah was over there without any dinosaurs to play with, it would be hard for me not to share with her, right? That would be the painful thing at that point. So now, the idea is I've kind of habituated myself to making it that by doing the right thing, I now have made it easy for me to do the right thing. It would actually be hard for me not to. And I take it that's at least kind of, one crude way of sketching the distinction between continence and virtue for Aristotle. Again, the merely continent person is the person who finds it really hard to do the right thing. They can do it, right? They have that kind of strength. But they don't do it easily. It doesn't come naturally to them. And so, again, to turn back to Kant here, the worry is that, when Kant talks about, actions that have true moral worth here, it looks like they're examples of actions the continent person would perform, the merely continent person. A person who can make themselves do it, but it's really hard to do. So at least I think it's pretty clear, at least I find it pretty clear to see why Aristotelians have this worry, that Kant, when he defines virtue, may only really be talking about what Aristotle calls continence. And if you look, and I won't go through them, but I've given you some examples on the handout just of virtue ethicists inspired by Aristotle basically saying this kind of thing. It's actually not hard to find this chart, you can find it in a lot of places. So 6 and 7 examples of that. Okay. So now let's, we've been picking on Kant so far, right? Now let's try to defend him a little bit and see what we can say. The first thing that I want to point out, and this is something that has been pointed out for quite a while, in fact, at least since the 40s with the Peyton book that I was mentioning earlier, and this is quotation 8 on my handout. It's been pointed out for a long time that, look, in the groundwork in these examples, Kant just isn't trying to deal with the question of whether or how it's possible to do the right thing from duty and like to do it. It's just not something he's interested in doing. Why? Because, and Peyton I think has a good way of putting it, what Kant is trying to do is he's trying to isolate these different things like inclinations and doing things from duty so that you can really pick out like what the core moral notion is, which is going to be basically doing things from duty. That's what's going to characterize having a will. But for that purpose of just doing that kind of analysis, it's not important for Kant to consider cases where someone really does both have the natural disposition to do the right thing and then also does it from duty. And so at least it doesn't seem to be ruled out by what Kant is saying here that that's logically possible. And if so, that can help, right? Then at least the real deep worry of Schiller here doesn't look like it's a problem, the worry that I have to make myself despise my friends in order to benefit them. Okay, and that's right, and this is right as far as it goes. I think it's just been established that Peyton's right about this, and there's lots of other contexts where what Kant says makes it clear that he's fine with having both an inclination to do the right thing and to be able to do it from duty. Okay, great. But I just want to say that, in some ways, I think if you actually think about this move, it doesn't really get to the bottom of the issues here. And why not? Well, think about this kind of example, right? So, I take it in this kind of example where we're going to have someone who does the right thing and does it, right, with the kind of inclination. We can start with the friend of humanity case again, right? The person who has this great disposition to benefit all these people around him. But now change the case. Instead of him having his mind clouded over by sorrow, maybe he just reads Kant, right? Which I know sometimes does cloud your mind with sorrow, but pretend it didn't. And he just reads Kant and he realizes, oh crap, I've just been but my actions haven't really had moral worth to this point, right? I should really be doing them for the right reason, namely because they're the right things to do. And it looks like he can do that without losing his sunny disposition, right? We don't need to tell that story. But now even here, right, it looks like he's going to get moral credit for doing things, basically insofar as he kind of, puts aside his sunny disposition and acts now from duty, does it for the right reason. So even here in this kind of case where we say, yeah, someone has an inclination to do the right thing, and they're also doing it from duty, it seems like the Kant story from the groundwork, at least, seems to make it the case that he's really only getting moral credit for this when he puts aside his sunny disposition. In other words, he only gets moral credit for it insofar as he imitates the person whose mind is being clouded over by sorrow, right? And the problem here seems to be, again, that it's just he's got these two things he can choose from, right? To do things from duty, right? Or to do things from inclination. And even if he's got the right inclination, he's got to choose the other one. And then the other one kind of falls away. So at least it seems to me, and it seems to some other people as well, that Peyton's kind of response here only kind of gets you halfway. It might help a little bit, but it doesn't really address the deeper kind of worry that the Aristotelians have here, which is that Kant still is presupposing there's kind of a divorce between the rational and sensible sides of our nature. That's the big worry. Okay, so now I want to kind of turn to Kant's theory of virtue. So this is kind of the second part. And I want to talk about Kant's theory of virtue in kind of two steps here. First, I want to kind of emphasize how very Aristotelian, and this is very surprising to some people sometimes, how very Aristotelian it is in a lot of aspects, I think. I'm really going to lay the Aristotle on thick, in that. And again, I hope that what you'll appreciate, if you agree with me about this, is that it's so Aristotelian that it really raises the question about, hey, how is this any different from Aristotle at all at the end of the day? I mean, clearly there's going to be some differences between Kant's moral theory and Aristotle's. But as far as the theory of virtue is concerned, it's not totally clear what the difference ends up being. So then of course I'll turn to the Pauline stuff. So let's start with the Aristotelian side of Kant's theory of virtue. For Kant, so the first thing you might just think about here. So let's keep on the table the example we just had. The example, right, where we've got someone who has an inclination to do the right thing, and also then does it for the right reason because it's the right thing to do, just kind of laying aside that inclination. What's the problem there? Well, again, it looks to me like the problem there is that it's just kind of like he's got these two separate kind of motives to choose from still. Now, hang on for a second. So let's just say, what if you could solve this just by kind of integrating these motives? What if, for example, so this guy, he reads his Kant, and he's like, oh, man, if this is really the right thing to do, I should be doing it for the right reason, at least if my actions are going to have a moral worth. And then he thinks to himself, okay, so I'm going to develop my disposition of right, liking to do good around me. I can develop my disposition precisely because it helps me do the right thing. So what if I can cultivate the sensible side of my nature? What if I can cultivate my feelings and cultivate my desires in such a way that I'm basically kind of building morality kind of into them? In other words, what if my motivation for cultivating my sympathetic nature, or whatever it is the fact that a person with a sympathetic nature is more likely to do the right sorts of things? Now just notice, so if Kant could say something like that, in some ways this would give him a neat kind of solution, I think, to the problem here. Because then, right, when I act some way from my sunny disposition, but I have a sunny disposition not just because I naturally have it, but at least in part because I've cultivated it, right, for moral reasons. Now all of a sudden when I'm acting from inclination, it's not like I'm not acting from reason, right? It's like reason is kind of built into my inclinations. I'm building the moral motivation into my sensible motivations, basically. And I mean, and if you think back to Aristotle, and if you've done much with Aristotle, I mean, this is a very Aristotelian sort of story, right? So the question is, okay, is any route like this available to Kant? And my view is, yeah. And my view is this is exactly what Kant's view is, actually. And again, that may be surprising, but this is what I think. So let me try to now defend that Kant not just can say this, but actually does want to say something like this. The first thing I just want to say is, so you might think, boy, this is a complete non-starter, because look at quotation 4 that we looked at earlier, right? In quotation 4, right, the problem looks like, right, virtue is just defined as moral conviction in conflict. Right? And if virtue is just defined that way, or at least if that's a chief characterization of it, then how can Kant tell this kind of story at all? But now I want you to notice, I mean, when he says moral conviction in conflict, I mean, notice what the contrast is. Moral conviction in conflict, and not holiness in the supposed possession of the complete purity of the will's convictions. So if we want to understand what it means to have a moral conviction in conflict, and especially if we want to kind of understand that in conflict phrase there, we have to understand what the contrast is, and that's holiness. Now holiness for Kant, I think this is quite clear. Holiness would be if you could completely basically get rid of any sensible inclination ever to do the wrong thing. If you could if you could build reason all the way into your sensible nature, so that your sensible nature is completely subservient to reason. And that Kant thinks that no one could ever finish the job with. But now I just want to say, I mean, I don't think Aristotle thinks you can finish the job with that either, right? I mean, at least very few Aristotelians would want to pin that kind of position on Aristotle, I think. So if you so I just want to notice. I mean, the idea of moral conviction and conflict, if that's what it means, and I do think is what it means, and in fact you can compare it again in 5. The contrast is with a holy being. This is how he usually talks about these things. Strength in conflict is not holiness, and this is usually the way he talks about it. If that's the right way to think about it, then that's not really that different from Aristotle's view. The in conflict part is just to kind of recognize that we can't finish the job. That's really what it's supposed to do. So that's just kind of, so I'm saying, okay, so we can work with this at least, but I still haven't said how Kant's account is really supposed to work. So let me say some more about it now. So Kant's view is that virtue is supposed to be something which is, well, as he says in 4, it's like a moral condition. And if you compare it to 13, which I won't say too much about, but in 13, he talks about it being like a firmly grounded conviction. And virtue is always supposed to be something that's firmly grounded / again, a moral condition. And like in 4, you can contrast, it's a moral condition contrasted with acting from duty, which isn't like a condition, but seems to be like more of a one-off conviction that you can adopt. And so generally when Kant distinguishes the goodwill from virtue, I think this is the distinction that he usually has in mind. Anyone can act from a goodwill. In fact, it's crucial to Kant's moral theory that anyone can act from a goodwill at any time, no matter how down in the gutter you've gone, right? Whatever kind of person you've become, it's always possible for you to act from a goodwill in any given instance. But it's not possible without actually cultivating things a little bit now to be virtuous, because virtuous is a firmly grounded disposition. It's a moral condition. And again, the story is about how this works is not Aristotelian. I mean, you make the right choices and it gets easier to make the right choice the next time. That's kind of the idea. And so you build up virtue by acting from goodwill in a way which is kind of Aristotelian, I think. So again, so virtue and goodwill, the first move you gotta make is you gotta distinguish these things. Virtue is like a moral condition. Goodwill is something that anybody can adopt, even if you don't have this firmly grounded disposition. Virtue, it requires that latter. Okay. So how do you develop the right kind of moral strength consistently for Kant? Again, the basic story I think is quite Aristotelian. So let me just give you 2 examples. One is like a very specific example, and then one is kind of more the general point, I think. So the specific example is what Kant says about sympathy. And this is now from the Doctrine of Virtues, the Doctrine of Virtue in the Metaphysics of Morals. And this is the 9th quotation on your handout. So maybe I won't read this whole thing, but I mean, what Kant is generally saying in this section is that we have a duty to cultivate our natural feeling of sympathy. Why? Well, not for surprising reasons, because doing so will help us basically fulfill the dictates of the moral law. And so we have these duties, and it's part of, he's got a number of things in this section, and sympathy is like the big one he's talking about, but the general story is he wants us to cultivate our feelings so that we can be the kind of people who can act from the moral law consistently. That's the general story. Again, I think it's a very Aristotelian kind of thought here. And I mean, if you want to say a little bit more, so why would sympathy help us? I mean, so Barbara Herrmann's done a lot of work on this, and one of the ideas is that, look, if you can cultivate your feeling of sympathy, you can be more like perceptive to the morally relevant features of situations, right? And that seems right to me. And so we've got that. It helps us kind of pick up on like what even is the moral situation that we're in. But secondly, it also gives us, it makes it easier for us to do the right thing. So I think there's both of these aspects to it. And the general rule, and I think, now this is something that Kant really emphasizes in his works in the 1790s. So this, I know my own view is I don't think there's really a change in view here, but there's definitely a change in emphasis. But I think that this is Kant's mature view, and I think the way to understand his view for most of things is that what's really important when it comes to whether you're going to act on sensible or rational motives isn't like you're just choosing one or the other. That's kind of this either-or sort of picture that, like the way I was talking about the groundwork example, makes it kind of look. But that seems to be not the way he wants to talk about it by the time we get to the religion or the metaphysics of morals. Instead, it's about the proper subordination. So 10, and you can find a bunch of other quotes that kind of look like this around this time. Hence the difference whether the human being is good or evil must not lie in the difference between the incentives that he incorporates into his maxim, but in their subordination, which of the two he makes the condition of the other. And it's very clear from the context. He's talking about like sensible versus rational incentives. It's not which one you pick, it's whether you subordinate them. And if you look in the Metaphysics of Morals, which is actually where he goes through and he derives a whole bunch of duties, like the duty not to commit suicide, for example. I'm going to say 65, 70% of the time, the way he actually derives these duties is by making this move here. So why shouldn't you commit suicide? Because to do so would be to subordinate your rational incentives to your sensible incentives. And that's the basic story and how it's supposed to work. It's hard. But I mean, that's like the strategy that he's employing over and over again in the Metaphysics of Morals. He gets old after a while. That's what he's doing. And so again, if it's about subordination, again, this is a very Aristotelian kind of picture, right? It's about acting for reasons, but being able to, right? It's not, well, let me put it this way. It's not that you can't act from the sensible side of your nature, but it has to be subordinated to the rational side of your nature. So someone who's virtuous, right, is someone who lives under rational principles, but living under rational principles doesn't mean only ever choosing rationally, right? It means you can choose on the basis of sensible things, and you get moral credit for doing that insofar as you've kind of built reason into your sensibility, basically. Again, very close to Aristotle's view on this. And I just want to say, I mean, part of the reason why Kant doesn't mention Aristotle more is he just takes a lot of these things for granted. I mean, there's a lot of the Wolffian kind of moral theory that he's working in has a lot of very Aristotelian elements, so he just takes a lot of this stuff for granted. Okay, so let's see. I want to skip a few things so I make sure I get to the next part and give it some time. Last thing I guess I'll just say about this is if you dig a little bit deeper and you go below the Metaphysics of Morals and the religion and you look at a lot of the lectures on ethics and some of the unpublished stuff in this area, I think you just see this picture get confirmed more and more. And in fact, the details of the story are even more Aristotelian. So virtue is connected with character. How do you build character? I won't read it, but 12 talks about this. You have to master yourself. How do you do it? By constantly withstanding your disposition by laws of reason. You form principles for acting, and you form your character, right? And of course, Kant has some funny views on this. I don't think he thinks women really have character, for example. This is why? Because in Kant's, it's interesting. Why don't they have character in Kant's view? It's because they're always slaves to their sensibility. Not a surprising view for someone to hold at this time, unfortunately. But it kind of gives you an idea. Character is about kind of building principles into it. And you really have like, not just a wishy-washy character, but you have like a character. And he says like character and manliness are very connected for him. You have like a manly character when you've basically kind of subordinated in the right sort of way your sensible incentives to your rational ones. So again, the story, whatever issues it might have, the story fits with Aristotle. Okay, so last two things I just want to say about this. So there's still two worries that you might really have here about how Aristotelian I'm making Kant sound, right? The first worry is just, hey, but he even says virtue is moral strength in conflict. I hope I've kind of assuaged that worry, but again, just go back and you look at when he's defining what that in conflict phrase means, it's always the contrast with holiness. And I don't think there's a real contrast with Aristotle there at all. The second thing that you could point to is passages like 14, where Kant is very careful to differentiate virtue from anything like a skill or a habit. And these are shots at Aristotle, or at least Kant intends them to be shots at Aristotle. So I won't fully defend this now, but I just want to say that, but actually if you look at his reasons for doing this, again, the reasons aren't reasons that Aristotle is really going to reject. Kant's worry about virtue just being a habit always comes down to the fact that, well, but, you can't just habituate your way into virtue. You need to be doing it for the right reasons. But Aristotle thinks you have to perceive the right sorts of reasons. I mean, it's a complicated story for Aristotle. And here the Aristotelian story about how we get reason in the first place into things is very different. Kant thinks that we have this a priori access to the moral law. There's nothing like that in Aristotle's theory. He's got a different theory of how we perceive, what is right and wrong to do and the reasons for that. But if you kind of hold for that difference, and if you kind of correct for that, the view is the same, is that you get, and it's not just that you form habits. No, for Aristotle you form rational habits, right? That's the whole point. And so at least Kant oftentimes I think is making it look like there's a bigger disagreement with Aristotle than it really is. Because if this is, for example, when Kant talks about a Gewohnheit, a habit, and if that's what a habit is, like the way Kant talks about it, then Aristotle doesn't think virtue is a habit either. All right. So what's the Pauline story then? So what I want to say is that the thing that Kant doesn't think can be the whole story about Aristotle's view is that Aristotle's view of how we become virtuous is overwhelmingly gradualist. It's a really gradual sort of story in Aristotle. We, piece by piece, bit by bit, kind of build up this disposition we're having in us. How? By making rational choices, by doing the right sort of thing. And we build it into our disposition. But Kant thinks that this is not the whole story. In fact, I think this is a good way to think about this. As some of you know, right, when the medievals look at Aristotle, a lot of times the way the medievals want to kind of take on Aristotle is this. They want to say, okay, Aristotle's right as far as it goes in this area, and then they kind of add a greater context, oftentimes like a religious context, and say, now here's the big picture, and you can see why Aristotle, what he says is true, but it has like restricted validity. Thomas makes this move quite a bit. Kant is kind of making a move like that here, I think, because he wants to say that what Aristotle is saying is all correct, basically, from a certain kind of viewpoint. And I'll say more about it, but it's basically the viewpoint when we consider ourselves as we appear, when we consider ourselves as appearances. That's the story that we have to tell about how we develop virtue. It's the Aristotelian. But again, that's not the only game in town, Kant says, and you don't have a complete theory of virtue unless you have both of these stories kind of running. So the other story is this Pauline one, and again, it's a turn towards Christian theology to give him some substance here. Although I take it, he's not relying on revelation or anything like that here, right? And he just thinks that Paul's got something deeply right. And the phrases that he really likes from Paul, so I've given you a couple passages, 15 and 16 here. He really likes when Paul talks about putting on the new man. It's a quite striking image in some of Paul's letters. And let me just say something about this image here, right? The idea is that you have to put on a new man. It's weird, right? Because it sounds like you're putting on like a new dress of clothes, right? But of course, if you're putting on a new set of clothes, the presupposition is that you yourself are the same. It's just that the outfit is new, right? You found a cuter outfit in your closet, so you got changed. It's like every morning for me. Finally, you get the right outfit. But like you're the same person. You just have gotten a cuter outfit. But like putting on a new man is like, it's like somehow like it's like you're changing clothes, but you're really becoming like a whole new person in doing that. And you should also think in this context about like Paul's famous conversion story on the road to Damascus, right? So Paul is supposed to be, and there's a lot of, I guess, striking things about this story, but maybe the most striking thing about this story is that like, think about like the principles by which Saul, lives his life, Paul before the conversion, and then the principles by which Paul after the conversion lived his life. It's not like he's adjusted his principles in some way. It's like from the ground up he's built a new one. Like what, if you had to describe what was like Saul's, principle that he lived by, like persecute Christians. It's almost a caricature. Like that's who he is. After the conversion, what's his principle? Spread the word of Jesus. The principles are completely different, and so much so that I think Paul, of course, the name change goes this way, and Paul thinks of himself as putting on a new man at that moment, right? And Kant thinks there's something deeply right about this, about moral experience. He thinks. So Kant thinks that you have to think of, at least in a certain standpoint, I'll qualify this in a moment, you have to think about this in a certain way as you have to have a moral revolution to ground your character if you're going to become the new man, basically. Really, if you understand, I think Kant thinks that if you understand what the moral law is really requiring of you at the end of the day, when it's not just about what to do in this particular situation, but when it's about who to be, the answer about who to be isn't like you, but a better version of you. The answer is actually be someone else with new principles kind of from the ground up. It's not like work around the edges and get slightly better at the things you do until you're finally a whole lot better. No, you got to like shed the old skin, right, and put on the new man. Kant thinks. And you get a lot of this, you see this a lot in the religion here. So just 17 as an example quotation, right? Although physically he's still the same culpable human being and must be judged as such for a moral tribunal of justice. And how insulted by himself. In his new conviction, as an intelligible being, In the sight of a divine judge for whom the latter takes the place of the deed, he is morally another being. And what goes for, and here he's talking about kind of from God's perspective. God can know if we're the moral being, but we have to think of ourselves as if we have to be this other moral being. So it really is about assuming a new practical identity for Kant. So just to give you some idea, and if any of you are familiar with like Christine Korsgaard's interpretation of Kant, I'm like 180 degrees from her in some ways, because she thinks that the source of normativity is basically rooted in a continuous personal identity. I'm saying that no, for Kant, the specifically moral kind of normativity is rooted in an abandonment of personal identity. It really calls you to become who you're not yet. So that's a side of morality, and I'll just say this much. I mean, it's connected. If you go back and you say, so why does Kant have this view? It's connected. It's connected to the way that he thinks about the way the moral law speaks to us, and you see it in like the fact of reason argument in the second critique. He thinks that the moral law speaks to us unconditionally. If you understand the way in which it's unconditional, you understand that it's forcing you to think of yourself not just as you appear to yourself, but as you really are. And this is really important for Kant. So let me say something about this. So, as many of you probably know, Kant is famous for having, well, many people have always thought it's a very strange view, that there's two ways that we can consider anything. We can consider it as it appears to us, and we can consider it as it really is in itself. And we're like anything else in that. For Kant, we're like anything else. When we think about ourselves, we can think about ourselves as we appear to ourselves, or as we really are. And there's different ways that we think about ourselves depending on which perspective we're taking. If we're going to think about ourselves as we appear to ourselves, we have to think about ourselves as having a character that develops in time. Why? Because for Kant, time is the universal form of our human sensibility. Anything that appears to us, including ourselves, has to appear to us temporally. But when we think of ourselves as we are in ourselves, we're abstracting from the form of our sensibility altogether. And we're thinking now a quite empty thought, Kant thinks, but we're thinking about ourselves as we're outside of time. We don't appear to ourselves that way, but we have to think about ourselves that way. And this is part of the second critique argument, that the moral law always applies to us unconditionally. It doesn't apply to us just based on how our character has developed up to this point. It's not like, well, I've thrown my life away, I'm a drunk, I live in the gutter, the moral law doesn't speak to me. No, Kant thinks it speaks to you too, no matter how much, because you can't think of yourself as, in that way, you can't think of yourself as just having a disposition that's kind of developed over time. Now, to be sure, I guess I'm a little short on time, so I'll try to wrap this up in about 5 minutes. To be sure, Kant thinks that both of these perspectives, as we appear to ourselves and as we really are, have a kind of validity in our moral lives. In fact, I think it's really important for Kant that they both have some kind of restrictive validity. So, the Aristotelian story is right when it comes to the way that we appear. And we have to think about ourselves, in part, as we appear. Why? Because when we act in situations. We act in time, right? If we try to do all of our moral reasoning in thinking about the way things are in themselves, I mean, we have the moral law, but we don't get its application to anything else. We get complete emptiness in that sense. So we have to constantly think about ourselves as having a character that develops over time. And even if we kind of presuppose we take someone who has become a virtuous person, I think the story that they have to tell about themselves as they look back is a story of temporal development. They have to tell the Aristotelian story about that themselves. But now here's the key: is that that's not the only dog in the game here. There's another perspective that kind of sits uneasily. I think Kant would grant it sits uneasily with the other one, but we just have a tension between them. I think, which is thinking about ourselves not as actors in time, but now as having what he calls an intelligent character. And here we have to think of ourselves as constantly kind of facing this demand to put on the new man, to actually reground our moral identity. Because, look, I mean, part of the problem is, Paul has this nice, and Paul is lucky because he has a conversion and he knows it. At least it sounds like it. But Kant doesn't think that we can really know when we really have done our moral conversion. Only God can know that in Kant's view. We can't really know it. At best, we can try to figure it out from what we see around us, what we look at our lives and how other people seem to think that we're doing. And that's our best window into whether we've actually perform this moral revolution or not, but we can never know it. And so for Kant, it's really important that in some sense, this demand to put on a new man, to always, right, become a virtuous person is always there. So now what's the contrast between this and kind of the Aristotelian story? So on Kant's view, look, the virtuous person, yeah, the moral life becomes easier for a virtuous person. And the Aristotelian story is kind of right about that. Right? It becomes less and less the case that you have to force yourself to do the right thing. It becomes more a matter of almost second nature to you to do it. Kant's fine with that. But this demand to put on a new man never really goes away in such a way that, so for Aristotle, like, he's going to grant that you can't become completely virtuous, but it's almost like, right, you're going to see yourself as getting closer to virtue, right? You see yourself as constantly approximating a goal that you can never get to. For Kant, like, the virtuous person is always open to the possibility not just that her virtue needs to kind of work around the edges and needs to, right, and develop, as much as it can, but the really virtuous person has to always still be open to this possibility that her virtue is like a complete sham. Like, not just that she hasn't developed the right sorts of principles in the right sort of way, but like, she's not even the right person yet. Like, her ground principles are wrong. Like, somehow the moral law has gone wrong in her application to her life at a very deep level. And so, like, for Kant, like being a virtuous person, like, that kind of sucks, but I think he thinks that that's how it is. You have, on the one hand, you feel confidence in yourself, and you do experience this development of your virtue in time, but you've got to be open to the possibility that something's gone radically wrong kind of from the start. And if you aren't open to that possibility anymore, then in some sense you've kind of cut yourself off from the source of virtue in the first place. Because that's how the moral law kind of speaks to us. It kind of takes us out of our temporal way of thinking about ourselves and forces us into another one. So the last thing I'll just say then is that, so for Kant, the life of virtue is kind of weird. It's not as smooth a ride as it is for Aristotle. I think that should be clear. And I think it's not just a not smooth ride because virtue is just like Aristotelian continence. I don't think that's the way in which it's not smooth. I think it's a more subtle kind of difference than that. It's like Aristotle's ride, but there's this radical openness on Kant's view to the possibility of like fundamental moral mistake. And if you lose that sensibility, I think Kant thinks, then you've kind of lost connection, again, with kind of the wellspring of virtue in the first place. So I don't know. So I guess that's how I see the at least kind of a start of a sketch, both of how Kantian virtue differs from Aristotelian virtue, and also like a little bit of a sketch of like what Kant thinks it's like to be a virtuous person. And of course, you have to sketch out that last thing a hell of a lot more than I just did, right? But the idea is that those are kind of constraints you work in. All right, so let's talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Time for questions? Do you want to call it? Do you want me to stand at the front and call it?
No, I'll
You okay doing it?
as long as
Okay.
people are okay with me having no idea what your name is, I'll just say you. That's yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. It's been a while since I thought about either of these guys. So I'm not quite sure why a person who's trying to be virtuous as a Kantian can't know it with a little bit more security than you gave. This question just really comes, I really have not read very much of Kant on virtue, but so my memory is that if what Kant describes is when you do a moral action, you know it's the right thing to do because you kind of do a rational audit of your right. So you look for the consistency that so you check it like a math problem, right? So 7 + 3 is 10. You kind of know that's true, and in fact, it's you develop a kind of, so the word is respect for that, and you kind of know it's true. You can go through it and know you can audit yourself and know that you did the calculation right. Yeah. So if you look at, so why can't you do that across your day, right? At the end of the day, I can look at my day and I can think to myself, was I a dick to anyone today? And I can sort of go through my interactions and I can sort of go, no, good day, right? Because I can check all of those did I, universalize? Now I know we don't even get into the problem of universalizing the maxim, which is a nightmare. But let's just say we could do it. I could just go through the day and say, no, I did all the math right today. And at the end of the day, I got 50 math. I had 50 interactions, 50 correct math problems. Virtuous day. Then you do that for the past month and the past year and whatever, and you don't. So I could understand that I might have good days and bad days in terms of making mistakes, and I could be fallible in terms of how well I do the math and whether the math problem is complicated and so forth, and I've lost track and all the problems you get into with math. But I don't see why I would have to be open to the possibility that I'm radically off track.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Thank you. That's awesome. So, okay, I got a bunch to say about this. So I think the first problem is that, so I agree that Kant thinks that, yeah, and if we kind of spell out what a maxim is, we should be able to figure out, and whether it's supposed to be through going through this procedure or whether it's supposed to be some other way. And he's definitely committed to the idea that at least most normal people, who haven't over-philosophized, have a pretty easy job of figuring out which maxims are right and wrong. But here's at least what I would deny, at least on Kant's behalf. So I think that Kant thinks that it's actually opaque to ourselves, like which maxims we're acting under. So if we knew that we were acting under a certain maxim, right, then we would be, then if we kind of thought about this maxim and, this is right, it passes, that part's fine. But what we don't have, and I think that Kant denies this in several places, including Groundwork, is that it's not transparent to us what we're actually acting under, which is weird because sometimes you think of like maxims for Kant, right, as just like, it's the way you think about your action. But I think that's quite misleading because it's really like the principle underlying your action, even if you yourself don't realize that's what the principle is. At least that's what I take it a maxim is really supposed to be. So we can distinguish, right, between like a rationalization and like a maxim. And I think, and now here I'm going a little bit beyond what Kant says, but I think that a lot of times when people think about the way that Kant is doing kind of the moral calculus, they're thinking in terms of rationalizations, and Kant's really interested in the maxims of our actions, not how we kind of rationalize them to ourselves. So the first thing I just want to say is that, so I would deny that Kant thinks that we have any kind of transparent access to our own ultimate motivations as their maxims. So even if we knew what the maxim was, we wouldn't necessarily, and even if we knew the maxim was okay, we wouldn't know that we were acting under it. So then the second thing is, so to kind of build up off then, to kind of bring it back to the kind of the character thing, and I think this fits very much with the way that Kant talks about our character then in the religion. So I think this is further evidence that this is the way he's thinking about maxims in the first place. Because when he talks about kind of grounding our character, which is the thing that we've got to do if we're going to be a virtuous person, again, he denies that we can have like a direct kind of confirmatory experience that we've done that. It's supposed to be, so putting on the human is like supposed to be like making the decision to like live your life under the moral law and to subordinate all your other incentives to it. And it would be great if we could have like this confirmatory experience that we're doing it, but we can't. And so he actually does talk about, so he says, so isn't that just horrible? Like it almost sounds like, it's like you can never know whether, you have put on the new man or not. But Kant says even though we can't have any cognition of this, we can't know it, we can have hope, he thinks, the characteristic rule for hope in Kant. We can have hope that it's true. And what is the ground of this hope? Well, we look at the way that other people kind of talk about us. I mean, is everyone, every time we run into people, are they mumbling to themselves about, oh man, he is such a dick, right? Or whatever, right? I mean, that would be a bad sign, right? Or, are people writing newspaper columns, calling us horrible things all the time? That would be a bad sign, right? And we have to kind of look at how things are going for us that way. And that's not a surefire sign, but Kant thinks that if you can find something that can kind of ground the hope, and then God is the only one who's supposed to be able to know. Again, we can only have faith that God even exists, right? But God would be the one who would like really be able to like look into our hearts and know if we've actually made this moral conversion or not. Because when God looks at us, he doesn't look at us as beings kind of developing over time. Rather, he looks at us basically kind of from the ground of our conversion up. Because that's the basic principle of our action, and then he sees the way that is kind of instantiated in all of our other actions. So like, when God looks at us, it's like, he looks at us like as like a Leibnizian individual. We got this complete concept grounded in a basic truth that then is expressed in all these different ways. But we can only hope that that's the case, that in fact the ground is basically the moral law, and that it's not something else. So I don't know. That's how I see. That's how I see that. At least.
That helps. I'll react very quickly, and then I don't want to take up too much time. So it's an answer which just casts Kant into the same suspicions I've always had, which is that if the universalizability principle is a rational principle, and we're built with reason, right? So then this is the thing which is supposed to be able to penetrate. I mean, I understand that we're muddy mixes of all sorts of desires and appetites. That's why, we're always trying to see into cloudy water. And I recognize that's our starting point, right? We're polluted. Our rationality is polluted by our sensibility, our bodies, and so forth. But if reason isn't like a laser that can cut through something, then connecting to a standard which is also reason, then this now goes beyond the problem of how to determine which maxim. It casts doubt on the very faculty we're supposed to be inbuilt. That's supposed to be inbuilt.
Yeah.
Is that how you see it, or
well,
am I making Kant into a?
No, I mean, it's
tempting to make.
Yeah, let me know if I'm not quite following, but I take it this idea of like reason being able to cut through would be this idea that it always can be. I'm interpreting this kind of like a motivational. Reason always can be a motivation for us. Is that kind of what you had?
I mean, how do you know that 7 + 3 is 10? Right? There's something inbuilt in us that can recognize that's true. Right? And so the confirmatory experience is in part what I take to him to be talking about when he talks about respect. Mm-hmm. So respect, in a way, is a self-confirming connection between the reason that's inbuilt and the rational law which exists in the starry firmament and so forth. Yeah. But now it sounds like the story that you've told makes it sound like we never know which maxim we're acting under. We're always muddied by emotion and so forth. Yeah. I mean, it is whenever I've tried to teach Kant to undergrads. It's almost always, once you go outside of the examples that Kant gives you, you're in deep doo. And, especially if they're thinking of alternative cases. Yeah. So I'm just wondering whether or not, is there anything in there that helps us sort of,
So I think there is. And I'll try to give a very brief response. This is really interesting stuff. I mean, in some sense, I think the word is kind of a Hegelian sort of, or at least Hegel originally raises this worry that the moral law just doesn't give us anything, because either it's just purely rational thing, right, which we can kind of recognize, but then it doesn't do anything. It's an empty formalism, as Hegel says, or it's supposed to actually kind of now touch our sensible natures, but now that it seems to get muddied in kind of that transit, Mm-hmm. And so let me just say this, but we can discuss more if you want. And so for Kant, I think Kant thinks that there's a sense in which that's fine and that's right. He thinks that we have this irreducible faculty of practical judgment, and it mirrors our capacity for theoretical judgment, which is also this irreducible faculty, which means that applying the rule of reason to particular cases is never itself a rational sort of thing. And it goes back to this rule-following paradox that Kant gives us in the first critique. The same problem with practical judgment. How do we know that we can subsume this particular moral situation under the moral law in one way rather than another? Kant says there's no explanation of that, because any explanation would have to be question-begging for all the reasons why Wittgenstein will later point out. And so in some sense, I mean, it's just, I think at the bottom it's a very flat-footed thing to say here, but it is what Kant wants to say, is just that we have this faculty of judgment, which is able to do it. So we'll leave it there, but there's more to say.
Well, I was in regard to what Dr. Hildebrand was talking about reason being a laser. One of the big things in Aristotle is phronesis, and that is like a rational skill, not something that just is. It's like an inborn tenet that you learn all of a sudden, like, oh, I can pierce this veil and connect to these higher moral laws. That's actually a skill that you develop in order to make what Kant would call like substantiate different your sensible or your rational principles in given situations, right? Yeah. I think that Aristotle wouldn't even say that there's like rational or sensible principles. He would just say that your rationale, your phronesis, is the laser you always shoot at your sensible data to figure out how to determine what is moral and what is not. Yeah. Right. And what you were saying earlier about Kant not being able to know about whether like only God knows. Well, first off, that's a big difference between Kant and Aristotle, right? Monotheism, right? And then the idea that, because Aristotle has eudaimonia, right? That we're at the more virtuous we get, the more we progress, the more we feel, tied back to that idea of sympathy that you were talking about, very much so, that we feel like we're doing better. Whereas Kant would say that we don't need to worry about that because, only God can judge me in the long run. It doesn't really matter necessarily. So if I can just keep chipping away at this, the only way I connect that is having these super absolute rules that I, mire myself in all the stuff that you were talking about. So I do think that like the kind of contextual stuff about what they were thinking about with regards, to me, monotheism, like puts a big wall in the way, or is actually, we'll say this, monotheism to me seems to be the root of all the differences, or a lot of the differences between these two. Because Kant has to have this absolutist perspective in some way, but Aristotle doesn't.
Yeah.
So.
Good, thanks. That's really helpful. And I'll respond to part of that. So let me start with the first part. So yeah, I think that's cool. I like this way of thinking about phronesis, and I think this actually gives another good way of kind of characterizing the difference here, because phronesis and practical judgment are kind of look like they look like they would be kind of like Aristotle and Kant's kind of view for the same thing, but they're really, really different.
Right.
Why? Because I think it's right. So for Aristotle, phronesis does cut through these things, and it's the thing that makes this reason sensibility distinction not. I mean, there's a distinction, but it's not like this impregnable fortress that you have to get through, right? But for Kant, practical judgment is always fraught for him in a way in which I do think it's not for Aristotle. It might be as it develops, but it gets less fraught over time. But for Kant, practical judgment, and same thing with theoretical, practical judgment is always fraught because you can never be sure that you're applying the rule in the right way to a particular case. And so I think that's connected. So that's cool. The second thing, just on the monotheistic front, I think I agree with that. That this is a deep source of the difference here. Now, I mean, am I going to be content just saying, well, that's the root of the difference? I'm not quite content with that. Why? Because, of course, Kant doesn't think that he's presupposing that monotheism is true in this, but of course he takes it that he's shown, that we can have rational faith that it is. But I do think that, at least in a looser sense, this is a source of major differences. So I think that's right.
Thank you.
Cool, thanks.
I had a question, just to, maybe it's sort of oversimplifying it, but the two differences I think of in terms of like calculus, so you take this sort of asymptotic relationship with Aristotle, you sort of getting closer, but then it takes this calculus, right, to ever get a concrete answer. But I mean, it's that way that calculus is sort of a trick, right? Because you've never taken this infinite regression, or I don't know if it's a word, but down to it, you can't really get it, but then there's this intrusion, right, where with calculus it does give a concrete answer. So I wonder if that's more like the Pauline conversion kind of moment.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, that's quite interesting because, of course, I mean, Kant is working in the wake of all these people who take calculus as a very interesting philosophical model for a lot of things in the early 18th century. I definitely think that, so I like the idea of, the Aristotelian kind of story of virtue is kind of being, certainly for Kant, he's definitely thinking that as a kind of limit concept. And it could well, and I think Aristotle was fine with that. So that's good. And I mean, I do think that the Pauline story, it would be the thing that if we had some like good cognitive access to like our success on the Pauline model, that would get us there, and would get us to that line that the asymptote is reaching. But again, it's just a different, I think for Kant, I mean, we can't even think of it as like completing the other series because it's just two different perspectives, I think, right? So that's my only resistance to that picture. Is that
it felt too simple. Sorry.
That's fine. Yeah, but I think that it is true that the Aristotelian story gets you close to it, And in fact, I'm even thinking of some passages in the Religion where that I think support this idea that the Pauline story really does get you. There's nothing asymptotic about the Pauline story. The problem is that we don't know if we fulfilled it or not, and so that's a doubt and a worry that we always have to have, because then God's going to judge us, and this is all pitched in the theological language of the Religion, but God's going to judge us, and He's going to basically, look, none of us are going to be perfect ever, but God's going to judge us, and He's going to say, if the disposition is really true and if it's a firm grounding, he's gonna say that counts, you know, and so it's gonna put us there.
We have time for one more question.
I don't know who is first though. I think I saw you first, but I'm so sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So, for example, if I'm not wrong, both Aristotle and Kant has virtue and it develops something that develops. You act, whatever you do in your daily life. So in Walk 9, it's the process of how you develop virtue in the way that your inclinations are more virtuous. But in here he makes this, he calls it conditional duty. So if I'm not, I mean maybe I'm wrong, maybe I don't remember quite
So he calls it what I'm just not.
conditional duty? I don't know.
Oh yeah, conditional duty,
Yeah. So, maybe I'm wrong, but wouldn't that make the whole process of making yourself virtuous into hypothetical imperative?
Into a what, I'm sorry?
Hypothetical imperative
Oh,
instead
right,
of the categorical imperative?
Oh yeah. Okay, so let me just say what I think. I'm not totally sure exactly what Kant means by the use of conditional in this particular sentence, but let me say what I think he means by it. So, when he says that promoting active and rational beneficence is still a particular, though only a conditional duty, I think the contrast that he has in mind here, but I would have to go back and check and see if this is actually right. I think the contrast that he probably has in mind here is just between the fulfillment of perfect and imperfect duties. So in this part of the metaphysics of morals, he's distinguishing between basically duties of love and respect. And we always have to respect other people, but we can practically love them, basically be beneficent towards them. Those are both duties, but respect is the absolute one, and beneficence is always conditional on the other one. So it's a kind of anti-paternalistic sort of view, that, and I think that's all the conditional here refers to, but it's not actually clear from this particular passage.
Yeah, because maybe I'm wrong as well. I read this in papers by Sellars, analytic philosophy, and he's going over Kant and the use of ought in Kant, and he goes on the categorical imperative, which is the perfect one, the perfect duties that you have, the things that that you respect out of the law, and then you have the other ones, the ones that are conditional, the if is, the if you do this, then you have this one. Those are the hypothetical imperatives. So my question is just I think it's a bad way of phrasing it, but seems to be that making yourself a virtuous person, changing your inclination, so duty comes naturally.
Yeah.
That seems to be kind of not one of his main maxims, not one of the things that he thinks that to be perfect.
Right.
So and I don't know, phrasing the question how important is virtue for Kant would be too broad, but maybe more how can we integrate the whole idea of virtue more into Kantian ethics? Because if I'm not mistaken, it's really set aside in all Kantian literature. Virtue is just a really small chunk of the what's the name? How you call it? It's consequentialist against
deontology.
Deontology. Yeah, the deontology is always that part that is stressed.
Yeah.
So how do we get this virtue to be more involved? That would be kind of I'm sorry, it's a really broad question.
No, that's why I feel like I definitely get what you're saying here. So let me say one thing. So as I understand Kant, even imperfect duties are supposed to stand under a categorical imperative. Now that may sound weird, right? Because there are imperfect duties, and it's true that if it's an imperfect duty, then we have leeway in how we're going to fulfill it. And so and certainly any kind of cultivation of one's feelings is going to have to be an imperfect duty, because you can't boil it down to at this time you have to do this, at this time you have to do this. It's more of something that you have to do over a lifetime, right? But to say that you have kind of some leeway in how you do it, I for Kant wouldn't be to say in that sense at least that that it's merely a case of the hypothetical imperative. No, we stand on the categorical imperative to do it. They're imperfect duties. They're no less duties than perfect duties. But we just that we have leeway in how we do it. So it's not in any sometimes you think the categorical imperative, you think, well, it can only speak to us it's one situation. It tells us that we've got to do this, and it's an absolute kind of thing, yes or no. But I think it doesn't always work that way, and I think imperfect duties show how it doesn't. So I just think I just think it's the distinctions are orthogonal in Kant.
Okay.
That said, I think there's still a question here about, especially when imperfect duties start to kind of clash with perfect duties, which I think is what Kant's alluding to in this sentence, right? These imperfect duties are important, but they can be trumped a lot of times, and so there are worries about exactly how far and to what extent we're really gonna be able to fulfill them sometimes. But I take it that, but we can talk more about this. I think the idea of like a categorical versus hypothetical imperative and perfect versus imperfect use are just kind of two different distinctions.
Okay.
Well, let's continue the conversation over snacks and let's thank Dr. Bredeson.